So if you believe we put a man on the moon, a man on the moon, well, if you believe that, then you should believe in big government. Hi, it's Jason from the Conservative Policy News blog, and if you follow this discussion, you will see why I used that song. I apologize for exposing you to my singing, but you got to make things entertaining once in a while. I was going to make the subject of this video Senator Chris Dodd's Financial Services Reform Bill, which I spent most of yesterday doing research on. If you haven't heard about it, it is the sweeping legislation that passed the House in December, and it is considered the biggest financial reform legislation since the New Deal. I'm not going to get into all the details here, but it has a provision I consider entirely unconstitutional, which allows the Treasury Secretary to denote certain financial institutions or businesses as too big to fail, and it gives him the power to shut them down. Entirely unconstitutional. Last week, Dodd's bill made it through the Senate's Banking Committee along a pure party line vote. The vote was in fact a surprise because the Republican had announced a strategy to delay the bill in the committee by offering a number of amendments. Instead, Republicans withdrew all their amendments and the committee voted on them. Here's how the New Republic described what happened last week. To the shock of everyone, the Republicans had withdrawn hundreds of proposed amendments and allowed Dodd to move the bill on an anticlimactic party line vote. The whole team was at the bar by 6:30, says one administration official. Geithner and his troops were hardly the only ones pleasantly surprised at the way the ground had shifted. Pretty much no one who follows the regulatory reform issue can quite believe the sudden change. The consensus now is that the Senate bill will be voted on once Congress comes back in the session after their 2-week recess. And it doesn't seem like there's going to be much resistance to it. I was first going to just talk about the bill, the contents, and some of the criticisms of it in this video. But this morning when I woke up, I turned on C-SPAN, and as usual, the subject of the discussion got my mind racing. So after listening to that interview, I thought I could bring more theoretical stuff into this conversation about the financial services bill. So what were they talking about on C-SPAN? They were interviewing John O'Leary, who is a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He is one of the authors of the book, If We Could Put a Man on the Moon, Getting Big Things Done in Government. So you see the reason for the song, right? Okay. O'Leary described the book and claimed that it was an objective look at the successes and failures of big, ambitious government projects undertaken since the New Deal. Now, I haven't read the book, but O'Leary claimed that there have been successful big government projects, and he listed some. As you could probably guess from the title, the first he listed was the moonshot, putting a man on the moon. Okay. He also included in the list of successful government projects the Marshall Plan, the interstate highway system, and welfare reform of the 90s. It was an interesting discussion, but I felt O'Leary was being a bit deceptive because he was employing a rhetorical technique, I thought, in order to convince those who would argue otherwise that it has been big government programs, their over-expenditure, inefficiency, irresponsibility, and corruption that over the years has destroyed the trust that people have in government and have made them cynical about big government solutions to social problems. For instance, O'Leary gave the example of the Big Dig in Boston, a massive government failure. If you haven't heard about the Big Dig, it should be considered a symbol of big government corporatism gone haywire. The Big Dig was a 3.5-mile tunnel that rerouted the Central Arterial in downtown Boston. Originally, the estimated cost of the project was put at $2.6 billion and was to be paid mostly out of federal funds. However, in 2008, the Boston Globe did an extensive survey of the costs and their overruns and determined that total cost of the Big Dig would reach almost $22 billion, if not more, and the debt would not be paid off until 2038. The project was infamous because it was poorly planned and ran into a number of obstructions before and during the build-out, and there have been a number of criminal charges related to the project as well. Leaks and other structural defects plagued the project and were found even after it was complete. Defects in the construction also caused the death of a motorist when in 2006 a concrete ceiling panel collapsed and killed Angel Del Valle, who was driving through the tunnel. Many have tried to defend the tunnel by saying that studies have shown it actually saves motorists time and money by cutting down on congestion. But the Boston Globe reported that the studies they did indicated motorists are actually spending more time in traffic now, and that the so-called aggregate savings reported by other studies did not take into account new congestion or congestion created elsewhere in the traffic system by the tunnel and the build. So on C-SPAN, what you have is you have phone lines, one for Democrats, one for Republicans, one for independents. I think during this interview, the callers on the Democratic line were getting the same sense I did about what O'Leary was saying. But because he worked at Harvard, he was well-dressed and well-spoken, they seemed frustrated that they couldn't call him a racist. I remember 3 calls in particular that came in from the Democratic line. The first was relatively incoherent, but essentially lambasted the close relationship between government and banks. The second was a plea that there is way too much corporate welfare in the system. And the third simply told O'Leary to go eat his own shit. None of the callers were really on point. And I found this interesting because, as I said above, I suspected that the book was written for Democrats in order to make the point as gently as it could to them that big government in many ways was over. As a matter of fact, I did find an overview of the book later on the internet, as well as a biography of O'Leary's co-author, who is William Eggers, who is the person behind the idea of Government 2.0, which is becoming popular in DC to talk about. So I started reading about Eggers and his outlook, and from the info I could gather, it pretty much confirmed my suspicions about the reasons behind O'Leary's tricky, subtle rhetoric. In If We Could Put a Man on the Moon, Eggers and O'Leary have found that there are some common features to failed public policy. I am going to read you those features on part 2 of this discussion, and then we'll get into talking about policy. All right, I'll see you at part 2.